He stepped outside expecting silence, but froze when he saw the maid sprinting across the lawn, with his disabled children running beside her. What she did next shattered everything he believed about miracles. The Wallace estate rests like a marble tomb at the city's edge, grand, gleaming, and hushed like a chapel no one prays in anymore. Billionaire Edward Wallace lives inside its perfect silence, a man who organizes sorrow with the precision of a quarterly report. His twin daughters, Emily and Harper, drift like ghosts through its corridors, confined to wheelchairs since the crash that stole their mother, and locked behind a quiet no one dares disturb. Then Amber Thompson walks in, not with polished shoes or references to his status, but with eyes that soften in the presence of suffering. She doesn't compliment the marble. She doesn't look at their chairs. She kneels before the girls, calls them strong ones, and then waits, as if their silence is not awkward, but sacred. And for the first time in years, the girls look up. Something unspoken stirs in the air, not just in the room, but in Edward too. Then Amber says 5 words Edward never expected to hear, and with them, the house begins to breathe again. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your engagement helps us bring you more life-changing stories like this one. Now let's dive back into the story. The first rule Amber broke was opening the terrace windows. Morning light spilled into the hallway like warm honey, touching the cold tile that had known only shadows for years. The Wallace estate had been a mausoleum of silence, but now, sunlight danced across the floor, and with it came the faint hum of life returning. Amber didn't ask permission. She opened curtains, played soft jazz in the kitchen, and brought in fresh flowers from the backyard garden the girls never got to see. "Every home needs air, light, and laughter," she'd said with a small smile, as if the house had just forgotten how to breathe. Emily watched her from the edge of the library, clutching her book but saying nothing. Harper peeked over her wheelchair tray, wary but curious. Then came the second broken rule. Therapy wasn't therapy anymore. Treasure hunt time. Amber grinned, wheeling Harper into the den. "There's a silver spoon hidden somewhere. First one to find it gets to choose today's storybook." Harper blinked, startled. Emily turned slowly in her chair, unsure whether this was a joke. "You don't have to move fast. You just have to notice," Amber added gently. By lunchtime, Emily had found the spoon tucked behind a cushion. She didn't smile at first, but her fingers curled around it like she'd just won something sacred. Later that week, painting replaced silence. Amber rolled in a cart of watercolor supplies, laid down newspapers, and invited the girls to paint a sound. Confused, Harper frowned. "Paint a sound." "Any sound," Amber said. "What does laughter look like to you?" Emily dipped her brush in yellow and painted spirals. Harper, quiet as always, chose blue and drew soft waves. By the end of the week, the white walls of the conservatory bore sketches of sunsets, birds, and fingerprints smudged in pastel joy. The wheelchairs, once tools of confinement, had become chariots for adventure, racing down the garden path during Explorer Hour, with Amber cheering beside them. Edward watched all of it from his study's second-floor window. He told himself it was reckless. The estate had always functioned on order, quiet, predictability. Now there was color, movement, music. Emily smiled at breakfast. Harper hummed during dinner. And Edward didn't know what to do with the ache that pressed against his chest every time he heard his daughters laugh. That night, after the girls had gone to bed and Amber washed dishes in the silent kitchen, Edward stood in the hallway and watched her. She looked up, surprised. "Did I overstep today?" He hesitated. "You've changed things." "I didn't come to change anything," she said softly, drying her hands. "I came to help them live again." He said nothing, but in his silence, something cracked open. Later, lying in bed, Edward stared at the ceiling, unsettled. That kind of light didn't belong in his house, not after what they'd lost. "Lord," he whispered aloud, for the first time in years, "what are you doing to me?" Outside, the wind stirred the terrace curtains, like breath had returned to a place once considered dead. And somewhere deep inside him, a door creaked open. The lawn behind the Wallace estate had once been manicured weekly, trimmed to perfection for no one to walk on. For 2 years, the grass had stood as a boundary, something seen, not touched. Until today, Amber wheeled Emily and Harper outside under the soft afternoon sun. A gentle breeze stirred the trees, and for once, the air felt less like a reminder of what they'd lost, and more like an invitation to breathe. "Let's try something different," Amber said, kneeling beside them with a soft smile. "Shoes off." Emily blinked. "What? Off?" Amber repeated. "We're going to feel the world again." She gently removed Emily's shoes, then Harper's. The girls looked down as their bare feet met the grass, startled by the coolness, the texture, the foreign sensation of nature pressing into skin that had been tucked away too long. Harper giggled just a little. Amber stood and held out her hands. "Emily, lean into me. Just one step. I've got you." Emily stared at her, 1,000 questions behind her eyes. No one had asked her to stand since the accident. Everyone had been too afraid to hope, too afraid to break again. Emily's voice shook. "What if I fall?" Amber's smile didn't waver. "Then we fall together." With trembling arms, Emily reached out. Amber gripped her hands, firm, unwavering. One step. Emily pushed against the chair. Her legs shook, knees unsteady, but Amber's grip didn't move. Harper watched, silent, breath held. Emily leaned forward and shifted. A step. Wobbly. Fragile. Imperfect. But a step. Amber's eyes welled up, but she kept smiling. "That's it, sweetheart. That's more than enough for today." Harper wiped at her eyes. "Me too," she whispered. Amber turned, heart full. "All right, warrior. Let's do it." They tried together. Emily and Harper, feet brushing the earth, shoulders trembling but upright, moving through resistance that had once felt like fate. And high above, from the second-floor window, Edward saw nothing, because this time, he wasn't at his window. He stepped outside, drawn by something he couldn't name. He walked barefoot onto the grass he hadn't touched in years. And there they were, his daughters, standing, holding on, wobbling like newborn deer, but upright, alive in a way he had not seen since the crash. His heart slammed in his chest. Breath caught. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. He just watched. It was Harper's laugh that broke him, bright, full, unfiltered. The sound ripped through 2 years of silence, like sunlight tearing through clouds. He stumbled backward, one hand on the nearest column, as if the sight had physically knocked the wind out of him. God, is this real? And then guilt came, sharp and sudden. Why hadn't he tried? Why had it taken a stranger to believe in miracles for him? Amber didn't see him. She was too focused on the girls, too wrapped in their quiet victory to notice the man behind the pillar, torn open by the sound of hope. Edward turned back toward the house, tears rising fast. Something holy was happening out there, and he didn't know how to belong in it. By the end of the second week, the Wallace estate no longer echoed. Music drifted through the hallways, sometimes classical, sometimes Motown, once even a country song that made Emily roll her eyes and Harper giggle uncontrollably. Amber danced in the living room one Tuesday afternoon, arms swaying, hips loose, inviting the girls to join her. At first, they refused. Then Harper tapped a finger to the beat. Emily followed with a shoulder shimmy. Soon, their laughter filled the room. Edward stood in the shadow of the staircase, briefcase still in hand. He had come home an hour early again, not because he needed to, because he wanted to see what Magic Amber was conjuring this time. "Come on, Harper," Amber called out playfully. "This is physical therapy. You just didn't read the fine print." "Is laughing therapy too?" Harper asked, breathless. Amber grinned. "Absolutely. Laughter wakes the nerves. Movement starts in the soul." Edward swallowed hard. He wasn't used to this version of his daughters. He wasn't used to this version of his house. In the evenings, he found himself lingering in rooms he used to avoid. The den now had coloring books. The conservatory windows stayed open. The living room carpet bore a soft impression from wheelchairs and dance steps. One night, he passed a guest room and noticed Amber's notebook lying open on the bed. He hesitated, then stepped inside. It wasn't snooping, he told himself. It was curiosity, concern. The pages were filled with messy handwriting, bullet points, and scriptures scrawled in the margins. Laughter wakes the nerves. Stretching disguised as fun. Don't rush them. Let healing be holy. God, give me discernment for what they won't say. Edward blinked at the last line. His chest tightened. She wasn't just helping his daughters walk. She was seeing them, speaking to the parts of them he'd been too afraid to face. The parts grief had silenced. The parts he had buried beneath work, meetings, and walls. He closed the notebook slowly, reverently. Amber wasn't just changing the girls. She was changing him. And that terrified him more than he cared to admit. That night at dinner, Emily asked, "Dad, can Amber stay forever?" Harper chimed in. "She says Jesus probably dances too." Amber blushed, smiling into her water glass. Edward couldn't help it. He smiled too. But deep down, fear twisted inside him. He didn't want to admit it, but he was growing used to the sound of joy again. Used to her voice in the house, used to light, and worse still, he was starting to hope. He prayed silently that night, unsure of what to say, unsure if he had the right to ask God for anything at all. But before he fell asleep, Edward heard laughter down the hall, his daughters, still awake, still alive in every sense. And he wondered, what happens if she leaves? Amber was helping Harper arrange a bouquet of wildflowers when the front door opened with a sharp, cold gust of authority. "Edward," a clipped voice called out. "Where's my son?" Harper's hands froze mid-stem. Emily's smile faded. Amber turned to see an older woman step into the foyer in pearls, a pressed suit, and the kind of silence that turned warmth into warning. Margaret Wallace had arrived. She scanned the room like an auditor, eyes narrowing at the music playing, the girls barefoot on the rug, the laughter still clinging to the air like an offense. "This isn't a home," she murmured. "It's a circus." Amber straightened her back. "Mrs. Wallace, I know who you are." Margaret's eyes were sharp, cold. She moved past Amber without a second glance and knelt beside Emily, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "My sweet girls," she said, voice tight, "what's all this nonsense about walking games and backyard dancing? You need structure, predictability, doctors, not daydreams." Emily pulled her hand away. That afternoon, the house changed again. The music stopped. Curtains were drawn, and the lawyer arrived, tall, serious, briefcase in hand. Amber didn't mean to overhear. She had only gone to the kitchen to grab Harper's medicine, but the words sliced through the doorway like ice water down her spine. There are inappropriate boundaries at play here. She's not qualified to be administering this kind of therapy. You're opening yourself to enormous liability. She needs to be removed. Immediately. Amber stood still. Her throat burned. Then came Margaret's voice, lowered but deliberate. "She's a risk, Edward. This affection is dangerous. You can't see it, but I can. Amber waited, begged, for his voice, for any word of defense. One sentence, one breath. But Edward said nothing, not a word. His silence landed heavier than any accusation. Amber turned away from the door, chest heaving, eyes burning. She had come here to help, to love, to lift the broken from wheelchairs and breathe life into forgotten places. She had not come for politics, for legal threats, for this. That night, Amber tucked the girls into bed in silence. "Are you okay?" Harper whispered. Amber forced a smile. "Of course, sweetie. Just tired." Emily reached for her hand. "You won't leave, right?" Amber hesitated. "I'll stay as long as I can." She closed their door, walked down the hall, and into the guest room. The walls, once full of joy and children's paintings, suddenly felt paper-thin. She dropped to her knees beside the bed. "God," she whispered, voice cracking. "Was this a mistake? Did I push too far? Please, if I'm not meant to stay, help me leave with grace." Her hands trembled, and in the silence, she waited for an answer that didn't come. Down the hall, Edward stood at his office window, watching the lights flicker off in Amber's room. His hands were clenched. His mother's voice echoed in his head, but it was the look on Amber's face that haunted him most. She knew, and she thought he had chosen silence. The words sat in Edward's mouth like stones. He stood in the hallway outside the guest room, hands in his pockets, back straight like he was giving a business briefing instead of shattering something sacred. Amber looked up from folding a sweater. Her eyes met his. Soft, unafraid. He cleared his throat. "I think maybe it's best you take some time away." Silence. Her hands stilled on the sweater. She didn't ask why, didn't argue, didn't plead. Her face said everything. Not anger, just that deep, hopeless disappointment, the kind that made you feel like you had failed someone who still hoped you wouldn't. She nodded once, quietly. "I understand." That was all. No fight, no begging, just grace. Wounded, steady grace. Amber packed as if trying not to wake a sleeping house. Every movement quiet, every breath held. She paused in the hallway only once, to take the sketch of a yellow sun Emily had painted off the wall. "I'll leave this with them," she whispered to herself. When she entered the girls' room, they were already crying. "Why?" Harper sobbed, clutching Amber's arm. "What did we do?" "You did everything right," Amber said, kneeling. "This isn't about you. Sometimes the right thing still breaks your heart." Emily's tears ran silently. She held something tightly in her hands. "I made you this," she whispered. Amber unfolded the tiny paper crane, delicate, a little crooked, made from the corner of a bedtime story page. "It's for courage," Emily said. "You said cranes mean healing." Amber pulled them both into her arms, holding them as if trying to memorize their hearts by the rhythm of their breathing. "Jesus goes with you," she whispered into their hair, "and I'm praying he wraps you in light when I'm not here." She left the paper crane on their nightstand, next to the sketch of a laughing sun, and then she walked down the hallway with her small suitcase, past the now-closed terrace windows, past the music that had long stopped playing. Edward waited by the front door. Neither of them spoke. Amber reached for the handle, then paused. "You were starting to feel again," she said softly, without turning. "Don't let fear make you numb again." Then she opened the door and stepped into the afternoon light. Edward watched her walk to the gate. Each footstep sounded louder than the last. When the door finally closed behind her, the mansion exhaled a silence so thick it pressed against the walls like grief returning home. The laughter was gone, the air stale again. Edward stood in the quiet and felt it. Something sacred had left, and he had let go. The new nurse arrived on a Monday morning, sharp and polished in white scrubs. Her name was Clara. She carried a clipboard and moved like time was money. She was efficient, precise, emotionally sterile, and within 3 days, the house went quiet again. No music played, no paint brushes or treasure hunts, no paper cranes or gospel hymns humming through the kitchen. Just charts, routines, silence. Emily stared at her therapy bands without moving. Harper pushed away her breakfast tray. Again, Clara made notes. Edward watched from the hallway, a pit forming in his stomach. The light in the girl's eyes had dulled like someone had pulled a curtain back over their spirits. "This isn't working," he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. He came home late one night, dropped his keys on the counter, and went to pour himself a glass of water. That's when he saw it, taped to the fridge. A small, torn piece of notebook paper. Amber's handwriting. "Remember to smile when they look at you." Edward froze. His hand dropped to the countertop as something cracked inside him. Slowly, he slid to the kitchen floor, glass still full, heart now spilling over. He wept. For the first time in years, Edward Wallace cried. Not the hidden, brief kind of grief he could excuse away, but the aching, gasping kind that left him clutching his chest like it might tear open. Because he hadn't just let go of a caregiver. He had driven away the woman who brought his daughters back to life, the woman who taught his home to breathe again, who saw through his silence and answered with mercy. God, what have I done? He didn't remember standing up, didn't remember grabbing his coat. He just remembered the surge in his chest that felt too holy to ignore. He grabbed his keys and stormed out the front door, the note still clutched in his hand. No plan. No destination, just one prayer, broken and raw. Lord, lead me to her. The engine roared to life. The house behind him, once so full of possibility, felt colder than ever. And as he drove into the night, street lights blurring past him like ghosts, Edward realized something simple and terrifying. He had waited too long once before. He wouldn't do it again. Edward found her at a pop-up market on the edge of town, beneath a faded tent with a crooked vintage finds sign taped to the front. Amber stood behind a folding table, carefully stacking second-hand sweaters. Her shoulders slumped in quiet exhaustion. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes, dim but determined, didn't register him right away. He stepped forward. She looked up and froze. "I'm not here to defend myself," Edward said, voice hoarse. I needed to say this. All of it." Amber said nothing. Her arms crossed gently over her chest, bracing herself. Edward swallowed hard. "I froze, Amber. You made them walk. You made them laugh. You made them live. And I let fear speak for me." The market sounds faded behind them, murmur haggling, rustling bags, a wind chime somewhere nearby. "I thought keeping them safe meant keeping things controlled," he went on. "Quiet, predictable. But safety isn't the same as healing." Amber's eyes didn't soften. "Words are easy, Edward. So is regret." "I know." He looked down, ashamed. "But I'm not here to ask you to be their mate again. I'm not even asking you to forgive me." He looked up slowly, the wind brushing his collar. "I want you back as family." Amber blinked, not because she didn't understand, but because it was the one thing she never expected him to say. He took a shaky breath. "Not staff, not hired help, just someone who belongs in that house. With them, with me, if you'll have us." Silence stretched between them. Amber looked past him for a long moment, eyes scanning the horizon as if she were asking the sky for clarity. Then, with a long breath and the whisper of a nod, she said, "Okay." That was all. Not an emotional speech, not a dramatic embrace. Just okay. But it carried the weight of forgiveness, the power of surrender, and the courage of starting again. The next morning, Amber stepped back into the Wallace home. Emily was the first to see her. Her book dropped to the floor. "Amber." Harper wheeled in behind her, froze, then let out a cry so sharp it shattered the last of the house's cold silence. They crashed into Amber's arms, weeping and laughing at the same time, clinging to her like a lighthouse that had finally come back into view. Edward stood back, eyes misted. The paper crane still sat on the girl's nightstand. Amber noticed it. She smiled, running a finger across its folded wings. "Looks like we still need a few more of these," she whispered. Edward met her eyes across the room. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Love had returned home. There was no sudden miracle, just warmth returning, day by day. The Wallace estate was no longer silent. Mornings smelled like cinnamon toast and sounded like Harper humming off-key. The curtains stayed open. The walls, once bare, now bloomed with color, handprints, scripture verses, and watercolor dreams. Emily walked 10 steps without help that week. Harper ate pancakes while giggling through syrup. Amber led stretches in the sunroom, turning therapy into morning adventures. And Edward, he laughed, out loud, sometimes with the girls, sometimes alone with Amber on the terrace, where they talked about things like fear, forgiveness, and faith. Then, one quiet Saturday, the front gate creaked open. Margaret Wallace stepped through it, heels clicking against the path, face stern, posture carved from years of pride. Amber stood in the kitchen, watching from a window. Her heart tensed. Edward opened the front door. "Mother," he said with quiet strength. "I'm here for the girls," she replied, "to see if they're still safe." He nodded. "Come with me." He led her to the backyard, where laughter danced between the trees like sunlight. Emily and Harper weren't just standing. They were running, barefoot, across the lawn, Amber cheering them on from the porch steps. Margaret's mouth opened slightly. She didn't speak. Her eyes followed their every step like a woman watching a dream she didn't know she needed. And something in her face cracked, not shattered, but softened like thawing ice. She sat down without a word, didn't criticize, didn't correct, just watched her granddaughters fly again. Later that evening, during dinner, Amber sitting at the table now, not serving from the kitchen. Edward stood, clearing his throat. "I'd like to make something official," he said. "Amber Thompson is no longer here as staff. She's not a maid. She's not an employee." The room quieted. "She is our care coordinator. And more than that, she is family." Amber looked down, overwhelmed. The girls cheered. Even Margaret offered a small, approving nod. But Edward wasn't done. Weeks passed. Spring folded gently into summer. One golden afternoon, in the garden behind the estate, where flowers had finally returned to bloom, Edward knelt beside the girls and Amber, hands dusted with soil, heart full. He didn't have a speech. He had only a simple question, and a ring tucked into the pocket of his jeans. "I was afraid of life," he said, voice low. "You brought it back to us. Amber, will you stay?" "As mine." Amber's hands trembled, but her yes came through tears and laughter, like sunlight breaking through years of clouds. Emily clapped. Harper nearly fell out of her chair. Margaret, from the porch, wiped a tear that no one was supposed to see. The Wallace estate, once a monument to grief, had become something sacred, a place where the forgotten were seen, where faith healed what medicine couldn't, where broken hearts learned to run again, and where love, real, redeeming love, got the final word.
If this story touched your heart, remember, God still sends unexpected helpers into our lives. Like, share, and subscribe. And tell us in the comments what family means to you. Someone needs to hear your testimony today.